"Speak when spoken to," the Duke snapped, and the card room went as still as held breath, every candle seeming to burn a little lower for the silence that followed it. Miss Verity Colston had only meant to say that the column did not add, that the moneylender's agent had carried a shilling twice from one page to the next and called it the Duke of Merivale's debt. And she had meant to say it quietly, the way she said everything, but the room had gone quiet first, and so her voice had carried further than she wished. She did not yet know that within a month she would hold the very floor he stood on in her own 2 hands. Had she known, she would have said it again, and louder. She folded her hands instead, the way she had trained herself to fold them, and looked at the fire rather than at the Duke, whose face had gone the particular gray of a man doing arithmetic he did not want witnessed. Mr. Crewe, the moneylender's agent, cleared his throat and gathered his papers as though they had personally betrayed him, and the neighbors who had come for cards and 12th cake and gossip found, all at once, a great deal to say to one another about the weather. Verity had been at Merivale Hall 3 weeks, a guest of old Lady Hollis, the Duke's aunt, who had been her late father's particular friend in the years before his warehouses burned and his ships went down within the same terrible fortnight, leaving his only daughter and heiress to a fortune she had learned, very early, to keep entirely out of her face. She dressed plain, she spoke less. She had discovered at 19 that a rich orphan girl was a kind of unguarded coin left on a public table, and so she had made herself, by careful design, the sort of person no one troubled to look at twice, until she opened her mouth about a column of figures. And the mathematics simply would not stay hidden behind her modesty. The Duke of Merivale did not look at her twice either, not in the way that mattered. He looked at her the once, sharp and brief, the look of a man who has been publicly corrected by someone he had not previously believed capable of speech, and then he looked away, and the moment closed over like water. Sir Peter Renfield, the district magistrate, a square, comfortable man who had known the Duke's father and disliked owing anyone an opinion before dinner, murmured to his wife that the girl had the right of it, whatever else was true, and that Crewe's sums had wanted checking for a 12-month. Lady Hollis said nothing at all in the moment, which those who knew her understood to be its own kind of thunder-gathering. It was only later, when the guests had gone up and the fire had burned to its red bones, that she spoke, drawing her shawl about her shoulders with the brisk economy of a woman assembling herself for battle. "He will apologize for that within the week," she said, "or I will know the reason why. And so, I think, will his creditors." Verity said that she did not require an apology. "No," said Lady Hollis, "I did not suppose you did. That is rather the trouble with you, my girl. You have never once required anything in all the years I have known you, and it has made you very easy to overlook and very hard to help." Outside the window, a robin sat on the frosted sill, puffed against the cold, entirely unconcerned with dukes or debts, and Verity watched it a moment before she answered, because she had found, over the years, that birds were easier to look at than people while she decided what to say. "I have found it safer," she said at last, "to be overlooked." "Safer," Lady Hollis repeated, in the tone of a woman turning over a coin to check it was not counterfeit. "Well, we shall see how long safety serves you. With Michaelmas gone and Christmas coming, and every soul in 3 counties whispering that Merivale's home farm is mortgaged to the rafters, and the note falls due on Christmas Eve. A man does not snap at companions over sums that do not signify. He snaps because the sums signify a great deal, and because you were the one person in the room brave enough or foolish enough to say so aloud." She paused at the door and did not look back when she added, in the dry, weighted voice of a woman laying a first stone she expects will matter later, "Perhaps, Verity, It is time you stopped being so easily silenced." Verity sat a long while after the door had closed, turning that thought the way she turned figures, looking for where it did not balance, and finding, to her own quiet alarm, that it balanced exactly. She found him 3 days later in the estate office, a room she had not been invited into, and entered anyway, carrying under her arm the very ledger Cru's man had muddled, because she had lain awake with the wrongness of that column until she could no longer bear not to prove it. The Duke was standing at the window with his back to the door, his coat off, his sleeves turned, hands braced on the sill in a way that made her think, absurdly, of a man holding up a wall that wanted very much to fall. "I did not send for you," he said, without turning. "No," she agreed, and set the ledger on his desk with a small, precise sound, squaring its corners to the desk's edge the way she squared everything that mattered to her. "You did not. I came because Mr. Cru's second page does not agree with his first, and because I think you already suspect it, and have not had the leisure to prove it, being occupied with a great many other things that also do not agree with themselves." He turned then, and studied her the way he might have studied a dog that had spoken. "You make a habit," he said, "of walking into rooms uninvited and correcting men twice your consequence." "I make a habit," she said, "of finding out when a sum is wrong, because my father raised me to it, and because a wrong sum left standing is a lie that no one has troubled to name yet. I am not attempting your consequence, your grace. I am attempting your arithmetic." Something moved behind his eyes that was not quite a laugh, though it stood at the door of one. "And what do you imagine I ought to give you for the use of your particular attempts?" "Nothing," she said. "Only the ledger, and an hour of your evening, and permission to be wrong about the 12th entry if I am wrong, which I am not." He looked at her a long moment, and she watched him decide, the way she had watched her father's creditors decide, in the half-second before pride surrendered to arithmetic. "1 ledger," he said at last. 1 hour. "And you will understand, Miss Colston, that I extend this not from courtesy, but because I find I would rather be proved wrong by an honest column than ruined by a dishonest one. And you appear, against all early evidence, to be a scrupulously honest column yourself." It was, she thought afterward, very nearly the kindest thing he had ever said to anyone, delivered in the voice of a man conducting a hostile negotiation. Lady Hollis, informed of the arrangement over dinner, observed that the Duke's father had been exactly the same at 30, incapable of gratitude in any form that did not resemble a contract, and that his mother, dead these dozen years, had spent her whole marriage teaching herself to read tenderness inside his ledgers, since he would not say it plainly anywhere else. She said this lightly, over the soup, the way she said most true things, so that only Verity marked how carefully it had been aimed. Verity's own father, she did not say aloud, had died in a manner far less dignified than a mortgage, a warehouse fire on the Bristol docks that had taken his ships with it in the same black week, leaving her, at 19, an heiress with more capital than sense knew what to do with, and a guardian aunt who had promptly begun fielding offers from gentlemen who wished to relieve her of both. She had learned, in the years since, to carry her fortune the way some women carried a concealed blade, close, quiet, and only drawn when there was no other way through. She did not yet know that Marivalle would be the room in which she finally drew it. The hour became 3, and the 3 ledgers became 5, and it was on the 4th evening, with the fire burned low and the Duke's clerk long since sent to bed, that Mr. Silas Radborne came to find his cousin at his work. He was a beautiful man in the particular way of men who have spent a lifetime being agreeable to those who might otherwise notice them too closely, smooth-voiced, immaculately cravated, with a mourning ring on his smallest finger that he turned, always when he was thinking. He had managed the Merivale accounts since the old Duke's death, and managed them, by every appearance, with the devotion of a man safeguarding his own inheritance rather than another's, for he stood but 2 lives from the title himself. A fact the whole county knew, and no one troubled to mention aloud. "You work late, cousin," he said, and his voice was very gentle, the way it always was, gentlest of all when he meant something least kind. "Miss Colston has found an error in Crewe's accounting," the Duke said, and something in his tone, pride, perhaps, or simple relief at not carrying the weight alone, made Radborne's eyes move to her with new and careful attention. "Has she?" said Radborne, and smiled at Verity, the smile of a man filing away a fact for later use. "How industrious." "Though I would counsel caution, Miss Colston, in the handling of another man's ruin. A debt is a delicate thing to touch, and an easy thing to be blamed for touching, should it go badly." "I have not touched his ruin," she said. "I have touched his arithmetic." "Just so," Radborne agreed, in the tone of a man agreeing to disagree at his leisure. He turned to the Duke, and his gentleness thickened into something with a spine in it. "The note on the home farm falls due at Christmas, cousin, whatever games Crewe's clerk has played with his columns, and no correction of a shilling here or there will meet a debt of that size. You must marry, and marry money, and marry it before the new year. Or I do not know what account of yourself you mean to give the county, or to me, who has kept your books honest these 6 years for love of your father's memory and no other reward." He said it kindly. He always said everything kindly. It was, Verity thought, watching him, the gentlest threat she had ever heard delivered in a warm room, and she filed it, as she filed all things that did not balance, for later study. "Gentleness costs nothing," Radborne said as he took his leave, pausing at the door to turn the mourning ring once more upon his finger. "And I have always been generous, cousin, with what costs nothing." When he had gone, Verity turned back to the ledger before her and found, 3 pages further on, an entry in a hand very nearly like the Duke's steward's own, and yet not quite, the ink a shade too black, too new against the browning of the page around it, and she said nothing of it that night, only turned down the corner of the page, very slightly. The way she marked a column she meant to return to. It became a habit, after that, the 2 of them at the long table with the ledgers between them like a country neither had thought to visit before, and she found that he was better company than his reputation allowed, dry where she had expected only grave, and grave in a way that made his dryness worth waiting for. "You correct me," he said one evening, not looking up from the rents book, "the way other women flatter me. I confess I find it a great deal more restful. I could flatter you, if it would speed the reconciling," she said. "Your Grace has remarkably fine handwriting for a man 3,000 pounds in arrears." He laughed. It surprised them both, a short, startled sound, as if the laugh had escaped some room in him he had kept locked for years, and only just discovered was unlocked at all, and he looked at her with an expression she did not yet have a name for, though she would, before the year was out, come to know it as the particular look of a grave man who has just remembered that laughing does not, in fact, cost him anything he cannot spare. "No one has said anything of the kind to me since my father died," he said, quieter. "They are all so very careful with me now. I had not realized how tiring it was, being handled." "I am not handling you," she said. "I am correcting your rents book. There is a difference, though I grant it is a narrow one." It was in that narrowness, that evening, that she came nearest to telling him the whole of it, that she was no mere companion of modest means, but the sole heiress of a fortune large enough to swallow his debts whole and never notice the meal, that she had already begun, through her father's old solicitor in London, quietly inquiring after the very notes that troubled him. She opened her mouth to say some part of it and found the words would not yet come, not because she doubted him, but because she had learned too well the cost of being loved for her coin rather than her company, and she was not yet certain, in the honest arithmetic of her own heart, which he would want more. "There is a thing I have not yet laid before you," she said instead, careful as a woman setting down glass, "and I mean to, when the time serves it better than tonight." He looked at her a moment and did not press, which she would remember later as its own kind of grace. "Then I shall wait," he said, "though I confess I am not a patient man by nature. Whatever my creditors would tell you of my patience with them." It was at that exact moment that wheels sounded on the gravel below, and a servant's knock came sharp upon the door, and whatever else either of them might have said that night was carried off entire into the cold December dark, unfinished, the way the truest confessions in that house always seemed to be. The letter came up from London 3 days after, and it came, as such letters do, at the worst possible hour, borne in by Radbornne himself, with the particular gravity of a man delivering bad news he has arranged to enjoy. It informed the Duke, in the dry courtesies of his own solicitor's clerk, that the greater part of his outstanding paper, the home farm mortgage, 2 promissory notes to a Bristol banking house, and the whole of Crewe's disputed claim besides, had within the fortnight passed from their original holders into the hands of an agent acting on behalf of a Miss V. Colston, of Bristol spinster. The Duke read it twice, and then a third time, standing very still by the window in the attitude of a man who has been struck somewhere he cannot show. "Colston," he said at last, and his voice had gone the flat, careful voice of a man walking on ice he no longer trusts. "There is only one Colston under this roof." Radbornne, who had contrived to be present for the reading, allowed a small and sorrowful silence to pass before he spoke, and when he did, his gentleness had never sounded more like a blade being wiped clean. "I did wonder, cousin, at a companion of no particular fortune taking such a scholarly interest in your accounts. I confess I did not like to say it while she sat at your table each evening, so agreeable, so very careful to seem to want nothing. But a woman who buys up the whole of a man's ruin in secret and sits smiling across from him while she does it. I do not say it is revenge for a harsh word spoken in a card room. I only say that I would not myself call it courtship." The Duke did not answer him. He went instead to find her, and found her in the small parlor with her father's old account book open on her knee, the one she carried always, its corners silvered with handling, and he stood in the doorway a long moment before he spoke, so that she knew, before he said a word, that whatever kindness had grown between them in the ledger room had gone suddenly, entirely cold. "You hold my debts," he said, "not a question." "I hold some of them," she said, setting the book aside with great care, because her hands, for the first time in years, wanted very much to shake, and she would not permit them. "I meant to tell you the whole of it myself, when it served you," he said. "You said as much the other night, and I was fool enough to think you meant something tender by it. I see now you meant something rather more like accountancy." "It was never accountancy," she said, and heard her own voice go thin. "It was protection. I could not stand by and watch a syndicate of strangers buy your ruin from Crewe and call in every note the same black week, and I had the means to prevent it, and so you bought me," he said, very quietly, the way a man buys a horse he intends to break to saddle at his leisure. "And you let me laugh in front of you while you did it." He was gone before she could answer, and she sat a long while with her father's book unopened on her knee, discovering that the safest thing she had ever done in her life had, in the space of one letter, become the very weapon she had spent it trying to avoid becoming. Radbornne came to her 2 mornings later, in the small hour when the house was between breakfast and callers, and his gentleness that day had the particular polish of a man closing a sale he believes already won. "I will be plain with you, Miss Colston, since plainness appears to be a fashion you favor," he said, seating himself uninvited across from her with the ease of a man who has never once been made to wait for permission. "You hold paper that does you no credit and him no comfort. Sell it to me, at a fair profit, I assure you, better than you paid, and I will see the matter quietly settled, and no word need ever reach the county of how a tradesman's daughter attempted to buy herself a duke." "I did not attempt to buy a duke," she said. "I attempted to keep one from ruin. There is a difference, though you appear determined not to see it." "The county will not trouble itself with the difference," he said, and his voice dropped. "Gentler still, gentlest when most dangerous. It will only see sit money reaching for a coronet, and it will not forgive you for reaching, however clean your hands. I offer you an exit, Miss Colston. Take it and keep your name whole. Refuse it, and I promise you, whole is not a word that will apply to you again this side of Easter." She thought, in the silence that followed, of every year since her father's death in which she had made herself small precisely to avoid this exact reckoning, the whispered sit, the sideways smile, the particular violence of a room deciding a woman's worth before she had spoken a word in it, and she found, turning the thought over as she turned a column that would not balance, that she was tired of the smallness in a way that frightened her rather more than Radbornne did. "No," she said. "I will keep the paper, Mr. Radbornne, and I will keep my name, such as it is, and you may tell the county whatever pleases you best. I have been called worse than a tradesman's daughter, and survived it standing." He rose, smoothing his cravat with 2 fingers, and if his composure did not crack, it thinned, very slightly, at the corners, the way ice thins before it is trusted to walk on. "Then I am sorry for you," he said, in a voice that held no sorrow whatever, and left her to the cost of her refusal, which arrived within the week in the shape of Lady Hollis's dwindling callers, of whispers that trailed her through the village like smoke, and of a duke who no longer sought her out over the ledgers in the long, quiet evenings, so that she took her supper alone, and told herself, quite firmly and quite falsely, that she did not mind it. The blow, when it came in front of witnesses, as such blows in that house always seemed to. It was the neighborhood's customary Christmas gathering, brought forward that year to Merival itself at Lady Hollis's insistence, and Verity had come down only because to stay away would have been its own confession. The Duke, cold and correct, had not looked at her the whole evening, until Crewe's own successor, a sharper, harder creature sent by whatever syndicate now fronted for Radborne's true design, made some pointed remark before the assembled company about ladies who bought up gentlemen's paper and called it Christian charity. Verity, who had promised herself silence, found the promise did not hold. "I bought it," she said, clearly, into a room gone still exactly as it had gone still once before, to keep it from worse hands than mine, and I will answer for the buying to anyone who asks it plainly, though I notice most who whisper of it have not the courage to ask. The Duke's voice, when it came, was colder than she had ever heard it. "You will oblige me, Miss Colston," he said, "by remembering that you were asked to speak when spoken to in this house once already, and that the lesson does not appear to have improved with repetition." It struck her harder for being nearly the same words as the first night, and she left the room with what dignity she could gather, and did not weep, because weeping would have been easier, and she had never once let herself have the easier thing. It was Mrs. Fenwick, the housekeeper, 30 years in service and twice that long in silence about what she knew, who found her packing her trunk before dawn and set a candle down upon the chest with the flat authority of a woman who has decided a thing and means to see it done. "Before you go anywhere, miss," she said, "You had best see what young Thomas Pratt brought me last night," shaking so hard he could scarce hold the candle steady, and crying fit to break a mother's heart, poor lamb, over what Mr. Radbornne has had him copying out these 3 years past. She set upon the bed a second ledger, older, its cover cracked, and beside it a bundle of letters tied with black ribbon, and Verity, opening the first with hands that had gone very still, understood within 4 lines that she was holding, at last, the whole of what she had only ever suspected, and that Christmas Eve, now 3 days off, was the last day on which it would do the Duke of Merivale any good at all. There was no time for grief, and none for pride. Verity sent that same hour for Sir Peter Renfield, trusting the magistrate's old friendship with the Duke's father to bring him within the day, and by nightfall he sat at Lady Hollis's fireside, turning the second ledger's pages with the slow, grim attention of a man who has found, at last, a sum that will not be argued away. Thomas Pratt, summoned and shaking, confirmed under Sir Peter's gentle questioning what the ledger already showed, that Mr. Radbornne had for 6 years kept 2 sets of accounts, one shown to the Duke and one kept true, and had used the difference to fund, through a Bristol banking house standing as false front, the very syndicate now moving to call in Merivale's debts entire on Christmas Eve, so that the estate must fall to a buyer of Radborne's own quiet arrangement and pass, in the fullness of time and the Duke's consequent disgrace, into hands he alone controlled. He told me it was no crime, the boy wept, only bookkeeping, until it was too late to call it anything else. Lady Hollis, presiding over the small council like a general who has waited years for exactly this campaign, declared that the Duke must be told nothing beforehand, since a man cold enough to accuse a woman of buying his ruin was not, at present, a man to be trusted with a warning he might mishandle out of pride. Better, she said, that he learn at the same hour as everyone else, before witnesses, where pride could not afterward pretend the knowing had come easy. Verity, matching ink samples by candlelight against the light of the window, the forged entries a shade too black, too new, exactly as she had marked weeks before, found her hands steadier now than they had been in a fortnight, for she had discovered that fear, once it has a proper column to stand in, stops feeling so very much like fear. Radbornne himself, encountering her in the passage the next morning, paused for the first time in her acquaintance with him without an answer ready, his gentle composure showing, at its edge, a single hairline crack, quickly smoothed. "You mean to make a scene of my Christmas Eve, Miss Colston," he said, and the ring turned once, twice upon his finger. "I mean to make a reckoning of it, Mr. Radbornne," she said, and left him standing in the cold hall with his composure working very hard indeed to remain composed. Christmas Eve came to Merivale Hall dressed in candles and holly and the particular hush of snow beginning outside the long windows, and the Duke stood before his assembled neighbors, his creditors, and his own uncertain heart to hear Crewe's successor pronounce, with evident relish, that the mortgage on the home farm had this day fallen due and must, absent immediate settlement, pass to foreclosure before the new year. It was into that silence that Verity rose, and Lady Hollis at her side, and Sir Peter Renfield on her other, and she said, in a voice that did not shake, though every soul in the room turned to hear it, that the mortgage in question, together with every other note bearing the Duke of Merivale's name, was already hers, purchased these 6 weeks past to keep it from worse hands, and that she meant that night to prove precisely whose hands those worse hands belonged to. She laid the second ledger upon the long table beside the false one Radbornne had for years presented as true, and held a disputed page to the candle flame so that the whole room might see the ink's telltale newness against the paper's age. And she called Thomas Pratt forward and asked him one question only, whose hand had instructed him to alter the entry dated the previous Michaelmas, and the boy, weeping, named his master before the whole assembled county. She read aloud then, from the ribboned letters, Radborne's own words to the Bristol banking house, plain and damning and entirely in his beautiful, careful hand, describing his cousin's ruin as a debt long overdue for collection. The room did not merely go still. It seemed to Verity that even the fire held its breath. Radborne, cornered at last where gentleness could not follow, let his composure fall away entire, and what stood beneath it was not the villain the room had gathered to condemn, but a thin, gray-faced man who spoke, when he spoke at all, of a governess mother banished each Christmas to the servants' table, while her son watched his cousin given the place of honor at the fire, of a lifetime spent one heartbeat from a title he had been raised close enough to touch, and never once close enough to hold. The Duke, hearing it, was silent a long moment, and when he spoke it, was not in triumph. "You might have asked me for a place at my own fire," he said, quietly, "rather than spend 6 years stealing the whole house to prove you deserved one." It was Verity, in the end, who proposed the mercy, and Sir Peter who blessed it as magistrate, no charge laid, no scandal named beyond the room that already knew it, only a modest annuity and passage taken abroad before spring, that the family name be spared and the guilty spared worse than shame, since shame, honestly borne, was punishment enough for a man who had waited his whole life only to be seen. Thomas Pratt, who had confessed unbidden and wept the truth into daylight, was forgiven entirely and kept his place. Outside, unnoticed by any but Verity, a single robin sat upon the sill exactly as one had sat there the night this whole matter began, and the snow came down soft and steady over Merivale as though the year itself meant to bury the worst of what it had carried. It was 3 days later, the debts torn through and the bonds returned to the fire's forgiving heat, that the Duke found her at last in the small parlor with her father's account book open on her knee, and stood in the doorway the way he had stood there once before, though nothing else about the moment was the same. "I owe you the whole of Merivale," he said, "and I find I cannot bear to say it that way, because it makes what I mean to ask you sound like repayment, and it is not repayment I am asking." "Then ask it as though the debts were never mine to forgive," she said, closing the book, "because they are ash now, and owe no one anything." "Marry me," he said, "not because you saved this house, and not because you were right about Crewe's column, and not even because I have discovered I would rather be corrected by you than flattered by the whole of the county besides. Marry me because you wish it, Verity, since that is the only reason on this earth I will consent to take." She rose and crossed the room and stood before him a long moment, and then she said, very quietly, "Speak, then." "I am listening, and this time I mean to keep listening," handing him back, transformed, the very words with which he had first silenced her, so that he laughed the same startled, unlocked laugh she had first drawn from him over a rents book weeks before, and kissed her before either of them thought to say anything cleverer. The wedding, when it came in the first mild week of the new year, was small and quiet by design. Lady Hollis weeping without shame at the back of the little chapel and declaring loudly afterward that she had known it from the first evening, whatever anyone chose to remember. Mrs. Fenwick kept her place at Merivale till she was ancient and imperious and much beloved. Thomas Pratt rose, in time, to keep the estate's true books himself, and kept them honest, Miss Araminta Vell, who had once been paraded before the Duke as a cold and profitable match, and had quietly warned Verity, in the darkest week, of Radborne's true design, married a plain, kind squire the following autumn, and thanked Verity for it at every Christmas after. Radborne wrote once, from abroad, a letter with no apology in it and a great deal of grief, And Verity, reading it, found she could spare him pity without ever once regretting the mercy that had sent him where he could do no further harm. In her father's memory, the Duke endowed a hall in Bristol for the training of merchants' daughters in the very arithmetic that had once made her safe, so that the wrong done his memory by a fire and a syndicate's callousness might, in some small ledger of the world, be balanced at last. Almost a year to the night from that first evening, the two of them stood again in a card-room dressed for Christmas, and when some careless guest made a slighting remark about a lady's boldness in correcting a gentleman's sums, the Duke of Marivalle said, before Verity could open her mouth at all, that he had married the one voice in England he trusted more than his own, and that any man wishing to hear it silenced had better first learn to add. Outside the window, a robin sat upon the frosted sill, entirely unconcerned with dukes or debts or the small, complete happiness settling over the house like snow, and Verity, watching it, thought that she had never once, in all her careful years of being overlooked, imagined that the truest safety would turn out to be the sound of her own voice, spoken plainly and heard. If this story warmed you, if you have ever been the quiet one in the room, adding up what everyone else refused to see, then come sit by the fire a while longer, for I have the kettle on and a chair kept warm on purpose. Tell me in the comments below which line you would have handed back to him if you had been the one made to speak when spoken to. And if you would like to keep your place here with us for the next story, the door is always latched open for you. Subscribe, and I will keep the candle lit. Sleep well tonight, and be gentle, won't you, with the quiet ones who have been keeping your ledgers balanced all along.